If those who don't watch many horror movies might dismiss the genre as nothing but vapid bloodshed and lowest common denominator thrills, we as horror fans, of course, know that that's just not the case. Great horror films are smartly constructed, thoughtfully written, and potentially packed to the gills with fascinating and important details on par with any other film genre. But even in our age of seemingly endless reams of movie trivia, sometimes the coolest details can get lost in the shuffle and fall through the cracks, enough that the vast majority of moviegoers aren't even aware of them. And so, what better time to shine a light on some smart and telling horror movie facts that deserve to be more widely known? From dead giveaways of a certain masked killer's identity you probably didn't catch, to insanely dark jokes nobody's talking about, and other sneaky yet important details scattered around, the world of horror fandom desperately needs to get talking about all those golden nuggets of info. And if you did notice any of these details for yourself, and better yet have posted about them online, then good on you. I'm Sean Verrick for What Culture Horror, and here are 10 important horror movie details that are almost never mentioned. Number 10. The Casey doll in Stu's attic, Scream. There are few things horror movie fans love more than going back through a slasher movie and seeking out clues which point to the identity of the killer or killers. And the original Scream has one hell of a doozy that's rarely brought up by even the franchise's ultra-passionate fanbase. In the third act, when Sidney flees from Ghostface by running into the attic of Stu's house, for a brief moment it's possible to see an incredibly telling effigy hanging up. Just in front of and above Sid, a crude doll bearing an unmistakable resemblance to the film's first victim, Casey Becker, can be seen hanging in a manner similar to how Ghostface left her corpse hanging from a tree. Given that this is Stu's house, it's basically an early spoiler that Stu is the killer, or rather one of the killers, and yet the detail passes by so quickly that it's incredibly tough to spot, especially in the attic's low-key lighting. Number 9. Pork ain't pork. Dog Soldiers. Neil Marshall's Dog Soldiers is a wild enough ride that you can't really be blamed for failing to clock the casual accidental cannibalism which takes place midway through the movie. When the soldiers enter the cottage, some of them start feasting on a stew left in the house, which one of the group describes as tasting like pork. In that moment, one might take it as face value, but considering that later in the movie we see corpses stored in the cottage's cellar, a cellar belonging to a werewolf family no less, we're left to deduce that the like pork was, well, human meat. After all, human meat is commonly referred to as long pork, so the comparison surely wasn't an accident on Marshall's part. Knowing that the soldiers were unknowingly chowing down on human flesh just makes the film even more twistedly revolting than it already is. Number 8. Father Karras' sacrifice is foreshadowed, The Exorcist. Now, to be completely fair to everyone, you'd need to have working knowledge of a century-old novelty song to have a hope of hell in catching this, but it's still pretty surprising how little it's discussed among fans of The Exorcist. We all know that Father Karras sacrifices himself at the end of the film, allowing himself to be possessed by the demon in order to free Regan, and then throwing himself out of the window and tumbling down the outside stairs to his death. Well, this was actually foreshadowed much earlier in the film when Father Dyer is playing a song on the piano, Ben Ryan's 1926 tune, Down on 33rd and 3rd. This particular song was likely chosen for one specific reason. There's a lyric which foreshadows Karras' death. The lyric reads, 3 flights of stairs is a hell of a fall. Given that William Friedkin suffused The Exorcist with subliminal messages, this is an especially eerie discovery that Karras' future demise was slyly hinted at much earlier in the film. Number 7. Bloodworth has seen it before, Final Destination 5. There's something that really only clicks into place on a second viewing of Final Destination 5. The first time you watch it, it doesn't seem remotely odd that the series' mainstay coroner, William Bloodworth, tells the film's death-cheating characters that he's seen such a phenomenon before, because of course he has. But this becomes a far more interesting talking point at the film's end, when the 5th movie is revealed to be a stealth prequel which segues into the beginning of the original Final Destination. And so within that context, Bloodworth makes it clear that he's been on the periphery of another group of people who found themselves targeted by death after narrowly avoiding their original demise prior to the known events of the series. It's of course not terribly surprising that death has been pulling this gambit since before the year 2000, but that it again happened within the vicinity of Bloodworth is certainly interesting. Hell, some fans have even speculated that Bloodworth himself was caught in one of Death's prior cycles, hence how he knows how the game is played, and that the intended victims can stave off death by killing someone else, in turn stealing their lifespan. Could this have happened to Bloodworth in the past? Either way, it's fun to think about. Number 6. Claire's body is never found. Black Christmas, 1974. It's no secret that 1974's original Black Christmas has a deeply chilling ending, where protagonist Jess beats her own boyfriend Peter to death, mistaking him for the killer. The cops then show up and put her to bed, all while the killer, Billy, remains undetected inside the house. Even though we catch a glimpse of poor Claire's corpse rotting away in the attic in the film's final seconds, it's easy to gloss over the wider tragedy of this, that despite the police arriving on the scene, they failed to find Claire's remains. Given that Claire's father, Mr. Harrison, spends most of the movie searching for her, then faints at the end when she still isn't recovered, it's absolutely horrifying that he's left to live on with the brutal uncertainty of his daughter's fate. And given that a Black Christmas sequel was never produced, fans themselves were left to speculate on whether or not those incompetent-ass cops ever ventured up into the attic. Number 5. How Jeff avoids infection, cabin fever. Cabin Fever is another horror movie on this list that's so damn wild you can't really be blamed for spacing on some of the nitty-gritty details. Case in point, not exactly a secret that Jeff manages to be the only main character to avoid becoming infected by going out into the woods. There's a little more to it than that. Earlier in the film, he makes a bet with Bert to drink nothing but beer for the entirety of the trip. A fact which serves him well considering that the fatal infection is spreading through the surrounding water supply. While drinking nothing but beer on a weekend away usually wouldn't be recommended, in Jeff's case it was accidentally the smartest thing he could have done, ensuring he made it to the end of the film uninfected. It's just a shame that the local cops didn't realise this and instead immediately shot him to death on sight. Whoops. Number 4. Foreshadowing the sword, Gremlins. Who amongst us doesn't love a good old instance of Chekhov's gun? If an element or object is introduced in a story, it will exist for a reason by the time the story is over. And Gremlins boasts a brilliant example of one, even if it's not talked about nearly enough. Throughout the film, there's a running gag where these strange decorative swords hanging up around the Peltzer household keep falling down. On an initial viewing, we might assume this to be a mistake which was kept in the film, but as we all know, that's not really the case. Later in the movie, when Billy's mother Lynn is being strangled by one of the gremlins, Billy rushes to her aid by, you guessed it, taking one of the swords off the wall and killing the gremlin. Though it's in no way vital for the movie to draw our attention to the swords prior to Billy using one of them, it's a great piece of sly visual storytelling which makes their use here feel totally organic. Set up and pay off, folks. Number 3. The mysterious fate of Anna, Predator. Though much has been written in novelizations and video games about the aftermath of Predator, it almost entirely focuses on the subsequent fate of protagonist Dutch. Yet Predator, of course, has a second survivor, Anna, a guerrilla rebel who gets to the chopper as Dutch so memorably instructs, and flies to safety with him in the final scene. While fans have talked much about Dutch's post-Predator fate, curious few have ever spared a thought for Anna. Though eagle-eyed viewers might spot a snippet of her debriefing video in Predator 2 playing on a TV screen in Peter Key's mobile headquarters, beyond that we're left to freely speculate. Perhaps Anna was granted asylum by the US government for detailing her encounter with the Predator, or if you want to be a little more cynical about it, it's entirely possible that the government washed their hands with her following the debrief. And given that she's a communist guerrilla and all, they might have done so with extreme prejudice, if you catch our drift. It's nice to think that Anna is living out the rest of her days trauma-free, but it's probably not very likely. Either way, she's basically faded into the furniture of the franchise, which is a fate she categorically doesn't deserve. Number 2. Patrick Bateman works out to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, American Psycho. Though it's basically impossible to misinterpret American Psycho as anything but a ferocious satire of masculinity and the tireless excess of the 1980s, in case you weren't quite clued in, there is a darkly hilarious visual gag hidden in plain sight. When we see a literally card-carrying psychopath, Patrick Bateman, working out in his apartment, he does ab crunches while watching the Texas Chainsaw Massacre of all things. It should be incredibly obvious given that the shot holds for a solid 10 seconds, and yet we're all perhaps so entranced by Christian Bale's chiseled form that we don't even notice Gunnar Hansen swinging his chainsaw around or Marilyn Burns screaming her lungs out. It's all the more apt considering that, later in the movie, Bateman of course kills sex worker Christy by dropping a chainsaw on her from his apartment stairwell. Number 1. The killers are listening to music, You're Next. You're Next is a film that continually subverts expectations, but one of its most chilling and low-key surprising moments is something that doesn't get discussed nearly enough. After the killer known as Fox Mask slits Paul's throat, Felix, who hired him and the other killers, chews Fox Mask out for performing the execution in front of him. And at this moment, we see a brief shot of Fox Mask taking out an earbud to listen to Felix, making the rather eerie suggestion that Fox Mask is just casually skulking around the house and killing people while listening to music. It adds a whole other level of callousness and unnerving nonchalance to the murders that, at least to Fox Mask, it wasn't a big deal at all. And yet, amid the film's many gnarly twists and turns, this sinister nugget of character shading is often lost.